So now that we've introduced the topic of stigma and provided definitions of it in ways in which researchers have tried to characterize and categorize different identities and group memberships that lead to stigma, I want to talk more about how this stigma, or how being a member of a devalued group gets under the skin to impact health. Right? So many of the papers on this topic use that phrasing, get under the skin, but really what they mean here, right, is being a member of a devalued group there's a psychological experience attached to that, right? So we said that just looking at these direct factors of being exposed to different toxins and being in different neighborhoods, that doesn't account for all of the variance in being devalued in impacting health. And so looking at the psychological experience of being devalued, of being stigmatized, how does that stress, how does that experience and the stress associated with it get under the skin to impact health? And so that's what we'll be talking about here. So this is the question, right? What is this mechanism that leads to members of stigmatized groups having poor mental as well as physical health? And so this is really, here we're focused on the physical health aspect. So there's a few, this is the overall model that we'll be using to explain this. This is a theoretical model of thinking about physical health and the relation of stigma to physical health, and what I will be going through this in each of the different parts. But what this is showing here is that there are structural factors, there are interpersonal factors, and intrapersonal factors, things about the institutions and the broader cultural environment that we're in, things about our personal interactions with other people and our interactions with family members, people in the workplace, people in our academic environments, as well as intrapersonal factors, things that go on within ourselves. All of those interact with one another to influence, first, physiological stress, which we know a lot about now from taking this class, and so those can all increase stress. They can also impact coping and health behaviors, and we'll be talking a bit about that, as well as this could impact the types of interactions we have with our healthcare providers and our access to healthcare, and this can also impact physical health. And so this is a model that comes from a paper that actually I did with some of my colleagues to try to organize this literature. And this paper is specifically about health outcomes of stigmatized LGBTQ individuals, but this also applies to looking at stigma and its impact on health across the board. So again, we're going to dive into each of these factors. What are structural factors, what are interpersonal factors and intrapersonal factors, and then these three mechanisms by which these factors influence physical health. So first, what are these sources of stigma-related stress, right? So we have the intrapersonal, the structural, interpersonal, and intrapersonal factors that all lead to more stress, right? So these can all be sources of stress. So I like this image. This is just one way to sort of visually depict this, right? We have the person here, and on the inside we have processes like shame, self-hatred, trauma, things that go on like within the person, your anxiety. So these would be intrapersonal processes. We might have things that are happening where you're interacting with other people. You might have somebody who is rejecting you. Someone might be shaming you. You might be discriminated against by an individual. And then on the outside we have these sort of broader cultural factors as how your group is portrayed in the media, whether there's laws that support members of your group and their equality, and how well that group is supported in different institutions, right? So that's the structural, the interpersonal, and the intrapersonal sources of stigma-related stress. Right, and so structural factors, again, this is not going to be an exhaustive list. These are going to look different for different stigmas, but these can be everything from, if you're a lack of handicap accessibility in many places, right? Even places that are meant to be accessible often are not. The elevators are broken, the ramp is way too steep, the doorways are not wide enough, and so a lack of accessibility, right? This doesn't just prevent people from going to those places, but it also increases a lot of stress, right? Even if you are able to access a place, you have to go through a lot longer of a process to do so. You have to worry about all the things that might be in the way and prepare for those. You might have to take an extra couple hours just to get to the place, right? This is something that is structural. It's built into our institutions. And so this is something that is a structural factor. Having fewer educational and employment opportunities, right? This really limits people in many ways, right? It might limit their ability to gain a higher SES status and impact health in that way, but also it can thwart people's needs, and it can lead to additional stress in people's lives. So these structural factors can also impact health. Wealth disparities, right? These are other structural factors that are built in, where individuals start off with very different levels of wealth, and so even if your income is one thing, but the wealth that you have behind you, money that you're born into, creates a lot of security and basis for you to be able to be less stressed in your life. And so having lower levels of wealth is certainly a way in which structural factors influence stress and health. And there's many, many more, right? But I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the interpersonal and the intrapersonal, because this is really where the psychology is happening more. And just to add, the structural factors would also include many of those direct factors that we talked about previously, right? Things that are about the way that our society is built and structured that systematically disadvantage members of certain groups. Employment policies, things like that. Then we have the interpersonal, right? So you've got the classic example of interpersonal stigma-related stress being ostracized, being rejected from a group. We have this little orange person here that's being ostracized, right? This is interpersonal sources of stress. This often is also referred to as enacted stigma, meaning that people enact this towards you. They have a stigmatized belief about you, and they act on that in some way. They say something to you, they behave in some way that makes it clear that they don't value you. And so this can be the experience of discrimination, social exclusion, harassment, rejection, having your family disown you for coming out as gay, right? All of these would be examples of interpersonal sources of stigma-related stress. And then we have the intrapersonal, and this is what's happening within the person, right? And so, stigma exerts itself not just from how other people treat us, but you're usually aware of our membership of these devalued groups, and this can take a toll on us as well, and particularly for people who are members of groups that are where you might be more isolated, that particularly for things that are not tribal stigmas, where right, you might not have other people around you that share your group membership. And so this is something that in my own work I was really interested in graduate school, and actually still am, but this is what a lot of my research was on in relation to LGBTQ individuals and internalized homophobia. And so this is one type of intrapersonal stigma, but there are many other types, and I'll talk a bit about these, right? And so just the fact that knowing that your group is devalued can impact your health as well as your well-being, but we're focused here on health. And so the way that it does this is through social identity threat, and internalized homophobia would be like one type of that, right? But social identity threat is just generally speaking that psychological state of concern that you might be devalued or discriminated against or rejected or stereotyped because of your social identity, right? So whether or not anybody does this to you, we walk around in the world, needing to worry about that, and for good reason, because it's happened before and it might happen again. And so there's this extra vigilance that you take to situations. And so social identity threat includes everything from stereotype threat, if you've learned about that in other classes, right? Worrying that you'll fulfill stereotypes about your group, anticipating stigma, so anticipating that people are going to treat you negatively if and when they find out about your stigmatized identity, or once they realize that. Internalized stigma, which is just the general form of internalized homophobia, right? You can internalize stigma towards any group, and so again, this is when you turn those negative attitudes that others have about your group, but turn them on yourself, and you apply them to yourself and feel negatively for that, and you internalize that stigma. Just briefly, anticipated stigma, this is a really important one, right? So again, it's not just about how people actually treat you, but even if someone ends up treating you nicely, the fact that you might need to be worried about whether they will or not, and you carry that around with you all the time, can take a toll, right? So there's members of devalued groups, understandably, have heightened expectations of encountering prejudice, and so you have to bring with you some more chronic vigilance for threat. And so studies have shown that conveying to people that their identity is devalued, priming that leads to greater vigilance to threats, even if they're subliminally presented. So in this study, what they did was they had women all came into the lab, and they in one condition they overheard a male experimenter basically talking about how women aren't very good at these tasks in the experiment, and they're not as smart, right? So they're conveying that the identity is devalued. In the other condition, they didn't overhear that conversation. And then what they did afterward is they presented stimuli to these women, and they were flashed really quickly, and some of them did have threatening things in the image, like angry faces or weapons, and some of them didn't. And those who had overheard the devaluing comment about being a woman, they were more vigilant to those threats. And right, so this is an adaptive thing. Generally speaking, right? If you're in a threatening environment, you need to be vigilant to those so you can recognize them quickly and adapt. But what happens, right, as with chronic stress, when you carry this around all the time with you and you need to be chronically, constantly vigilant, this can take a toll over time. I have the glass of water there as an example to remind me that the metaphor that's often used is, right, it's not that hard to hold up a glass of water. It's not that heavy. It's hard to show on my camera. But if I have to hold it out in front of me all day long, right, my arm is going to get tired, and that's going to take a toll. It is going to be hard to get. It gets hard to hold over time, and that's true here as well, right? So the stress of this can build up this constant vigilance. Then we have internalized stigma, which I've already been touching on, but this is that self-stigma, when you accept those negative stereotypes and you apply them to yourself. And I shouldn't use the word acceptance. It doesn't mean that you necessarily endorse them consciously, but they have been turned in on yourself, right? So with the example of internalized homophobia, right, I might consciously really believe that, there is nothing wrong with being gay, but I might, still feel really negatively about myself for that. And that would be that internalized homophobia, where you still have some shame around that identity, and those negative stereotypes, even if you don't consciously endorse them, you feel like they might apply to you, and you're worried about conforming to those, and you feel negative about this identity. And so this is most commonly studied with internalized homophobia, but again, you can internalize many different types of stigma, and people do. And to the extent that you've internalized these negative things about your group, that is very stressful. It's deeply stressful, and that also has been shown to impact health. So as we said, all of these things, all of those factors lead to more stress. Right? There's more daily hassles involved in all of that, more vigilance, more anticipation of threat, and more actual stressors in your life as people treat you negatively, and as your structural institutions that you encounter are harder to navigate, and also explicitly devalue you and your identity. So all of these are stressful, and as we know, stress impacts health. And so through all of the same physiological mechanisms that we've already covered, these create additional stress. I'll post this link to this podcast will be posted also on our weekly page, but this is just a quick thing to listen to. It's not a long podcast, but this is an interview with some scientists who do work on this stigma-related stress and talk more about this, about how racism in this case is the example of stigma, one of the major ones that we're contending with as nations now, talks about how this gets under the skin and hurts health, and in some of the more subtler ways, right? I think we're very aware of the very clear ways in which violence harms people, but all of the other ways in which the negative ways in which we devalue members of groups, even seemingly subtly, impact their health. So listen to that. So now we've talked about these structural factors, these interpersonal factors, and these intrapersonal factors. And now I'm going to turn to the rest of this model, right? So we said these all impact through more stress, but they can also impact through shifting how we do engage in coping and health behavior, as well as our healthcare interactions. So I'll turn to these two now. So with coping, right, we already know a bit from taking this class, and we're going to be covering some more of these health behaviors as these lectures continue. But there are adaptive things we can do to cope, and there are maladaptive things we can do to cope. And when we're under a lot of stress, and particularly if we're not supported well by others, right, if we're socially isolated or ostracized or rejected as many stigmatized people are, it can we might be more likely to engage in maladaptive coping behaviors such as drinking and using drugs to excess, eating unhealthy, exercising less, and taking more risk behaviors. And so experiencing more stress can be related to engaging in more of these things. And this is one of the ways in which stress gets under the skin to impact health. So that and so it does so by stress, but also if you're stressed and you drink more, then that's going to have an effect on your health through the use of alcohol. If you, when you're stressed, you don't have time to get healthy food and to eat that, and you're eating really unhealthy food, then that's also going to have an impact on your health. And lack of exercise as well. If you're not able to exercise when you're really stressed because of all these stigma-related stressors, then that's also going to impact your health. And so research has indicated that members of stigmatized groups are at times more, and particularly the ones who engage in more of these types of maladaptive coping behaviors, are more likely to have these negative health outcomes. Then the other mechanism being stigma in healthcare, right? And so before we said a direct reason that being stigmatized or low SES impacts health is if you don't have health insurance. That's a really structural and direct reason. But other things that can impact it, right, is can happen at the interpersonal level. If physicians are often biased, even if they don't realize it. Research shows that physicians spend less time with overweight patients and prescribe fewer pain meds to black patients and to women compared to white patients and to men. And so basically indicating that they don't take their pain as seriously, or they believe that they're exaggerating that, or there's some type of bias going on there. Now, if you ask these physicians, most of them are not aware of this. They say that they're treating people equally, but there is certainly bias in healthcare, and this has been very well documented. And there's certainly in Canada a serious issue that we need to contend with is clear medical bias against Indigenous folks in the medical care system. So this is something that health psychologists are and should be very concerned about. It's also stereotype threat, right? So people might decide not to go to their healthcare provider at all, even if they have access, because they're afraid of being evaluated or of confirming stereotypes. There's a lot of literature of this, of overweight people, right? They know what the doctor's going to say when they get there, that whatever problem they have, it's going to be because they're fat, and the doctor's going to tell them to exercise and to lose weight, and they're tired of confirming any stereotypes that person might have, and they're also sick or afraid of being evaluated negatively and being treated negatively because of their perceived controllability of their weight. So people are less likely to seek preventative care. This is also very well documented among LGBTQ people, where they fear stigma and evaluation from healthcare providers, and so are less likely to go seek care. And then also you're less likely to communicate effectively with your doctor, because if you have to hide some aspect of yourself, or you don't feel comfortable talking about that identity that is stigmatized, then may not be able to share important parts of your life, right? So this has been documented again with gay men specifically, but if they fear that their doctor is going to be stigmatizing, then they may not share aspects of their sexual health that might be important to getting the treatment that they need or getting the health care that they need. But I think one of the ones that really has been borne out clearly in the literature is this less likely to seek preventative care. That if you really feel like your doctor's not going to help you anyway, or if they're going to treat you negatively or see you just in light of this stigmatized identity, right? This is that spoiled identity coming back, where that's all they can see about you. All they can see is that you're overweight, or all they can see is that you're trans, and not really address any other aspects of your body. Then people won't even go. It took me a long time personally to get over this. So I'm a trans man myself, and for a long time I only had healthcare providers who only wanted to fixate on that. If I had any problem, they wanted to talk about that. They wanted to know what my hormone levels were. They wanted to ask really invasive questions about parts of my body that were not relevant. Even the time I broke my thumb playing softball and went in, and they were very concerned about that. And I was like, I just need an x-ray on my thumb. It's really not relevant where I am at in my transition. You don't need to even know that here. And so for a long time I really didn't want to seek medical care at all, because it was like, oh, here we go again. They're going to have a lot of questions about this, and they might be judgy about it. And so people don't then seek the care that they need. And I don't tell you this to just have a sub story about it, but this is an experience that many people go through, and around lots of different identities. And so even if we make healthcare accessible, technically speaking, if it's not culturally competent, then it's not going to be very effective, and people, even if they do go, may not communicate well with their doctor and may not get the information that they need. So there you have it. There's the three sort of sources of stigma-related stress, factors that impact these three processes, right? So all of these three things can increase stress. They can also impact the type of coping behaviors that we engage in, right? And so if we are feeling really down on ourselves, a lot of internalized stigma and a lot of shame, we may turn to using drugs and alcohol to try to cope with that, right? That's not the best coping mechanism, but many people are left with very few things to use, and so these things feel good in the short term, but they do have long-term effects on health. And then also through healthcare interactions, right? All three of these things play into our experiences of healthcare, and together these three things can impact our physical health in the long term. I'm going to end that here, and then we'll pick back up with talking about an example of weight stigma and looking at stigma in that context.